All right, guys, so we're on to the last two sections of Unit 5, which are all about urbanization, its impacts, and some of the things we can do to mitigate those impacts. So let's go ahead and jump into our PowerPoint here so that we can stay on task and stay focused. All right, so let's grab this guy. Okay. So, as I said, all about urbanization, its impacts, and how we can mitigate some of those impacts. So before we can really talk about what the impacts are, we really need to understand what we mean by urbanization, and we need to talk about a few terms that we're going to use. So obviously the first term is urban, and that means of the city. So when we talk about urban, we're talking about impacts of cities. But there are also impacts from what we call urban sprawl. And so let's talk about these two terms. We have first a suburb, and we should be pretty familiar with the idea of a suburb, abbreviated burbs, right? And so this is an area around a city, an area around a metropolitan center. It has a relatively low population density, and since 1950, it has been 90% of our population growth. So the suburbs are growing extremely rapidly. The next term we're going to talk about is an exurb. So an exurb has very similar population density to a suburb, but it's not directly connected to a central city or a densely populated area. And so when we think about suburbs, we're talking about right outside of a city, and exurb might be a little bit farther out. So around the DC metro area, we find a lot of exurbs. They are usually connected to the cities by way of a highway. And if we look at the United States right now, you'll notice this is us here, teeny tiny little red dot there. So we have a large central metropolitan area. And then as we move out, it becomes more suburbs. And eventually when you get all the way out to Southampton County and Franklin area, we would really consider those to be exurbs. Okay. But you'll notice that all up and down the East Coast, it is mostly metropolitan areas. So let's talk about this idea of urban sprawl. So this is the idea that over time, and for a lot of reasons that we're going to talk about shortly, that cities kind of spread out, and they spread their fingers out, and it has impacts on a whole lot of aspects of our lives. So the city winds up touching water, it influences the roads, it influences waste, it influences how much things are, how many resources are being pulled out of the ground, how much fossil fuel use we have. So urban sprawl has a lot of impacts. So the first impact we're going to talk about is water. And we've talked about this a little bit as we talked about agriculture and we talked about aquifers. In urban areas, because there are a lot of people packed into a small space, we tend to draw a lot of water out of aquifers in order to serve the needs of the population. And we've talked about the fact that in coastal areas, so our area, Savannah, all of these areas that are near coasts, as aquifers are depleted, that allows saltwater intrusion. So that means that saltwater is actually able to flow into our freshwater aquifers. Okay, so just one more quick map of the world. Population density is, you can see, over 15 people per square kilometer. So one interesting thing, we think of ourselves as relatively urban, but you can see that most of the northeastern part of the United States is pretty dense. The West and Midwest are very not dense. And then the California coastline and all the Pacific coastline, Washington, Oregon, and California, are pretty dense. There are more people living in this little circle than all the rest of the world put together. And so you have incredible population densities throughout Asia, India, Pakistan, China, Japan, all of Southeastern Asia, incredible population densities there. And so we get into issues of the environment when it comes to urban areas and urban sprawl. So when we talk about urban sprawl, we're talking about these urban areas spreading into the rural areas, removing those clear boundaries between the two. And so really what has caused this? Especially in the United States, the number one cause of urban sprawl is the development of the interstate highway system and the advent of the automobile. So you guys know that the automobile, as we know it, the mass-produced automobile was invented in 1903, but it wasn't until the advent of the interstate highway system in the 1950s, after the Second World War, that we really, the boom in automobiles came along. And so, because the highways have made transportation between areas and from cities to suburbs so much easier, that has really caused a broadening of our urban areas, or what we call urban sprawl. The second major reason for urban sprawl is living costs. Generally speaking, suburbs are much less expensive than cities. In The suburbs generally tend to be single family homes. They are not your low income affordable housing. There's also a contribution from the idea that we call white flight, which was that when automobiles came in and cities started to become integrated, schools and all of our public areas were required to be integrated. A lot of white families that could afford to do so fled to the suburbs in order to avoid integration. So that was a big piece of it as well. That, of course, has contributed to urban blight, and that is the degradation of the built environment of the city that accompanies migration to the suburbs. And then, of course, blight accelerates migration to the suburbs. So this is actually a positive feedback loop. This does not mean it's a good thing, but it is a self-perpetuating and self-increasing. Of course, in recent years, we've had the opposite. We've had this idea of gentrification. So that is the process where an area that was considered urban blight is being restored, gentrified, brought back. The issue with that is that this then pushes low-income people out of places where they had previously been able to live as those neighborhoods become more expensive. And then our fourth major contributor to urban sprawl really is laws and policies. Whether those are federal laws like our Highway Trust Fund that was established in 1956, where we have a federal gasoline tax that goes to pay for construction and maintenance of highways. And you guys can see that this is going to be a positive feedback loop. As we drive more, spend more on gasoline taxes, there's more money put into roads. And then more money put into roads leads to continued expansion of the suburbs, which is going to lead to more traffic congestion, more gas, more roads. And you've probably seen this in this area. It always feels like as soon as we finish one construction project, the road is already too crowded and we have to start another one. This is also heavily influenced by local laws and policies, mostly in the form of zoning laws. Most of our traditional zoning laws separate industry and business from residential and agricultural. One of the ideas that helps to reduce urban spread is multi-use zoning. And so we can see examples of that in our own area. If we think about the development at the former Obacy, where we have condos, apartments, shopping, and dining areas all in the same area. That's kind of a multi-use zoning, and even more so when we start adding in office space as well. Another federal policy that led to urban sprawl was these federally subsidized mortgages through the FHA. Those offered very low interest rates, but they could only be obtained if you were purchasing in a so-called low risk area. And that translated to suburbs. And so while that increased homeownership rates, it also increased urban sprawl. So in an environmental class, why are we talking about urban sprawl? Because it matters. It has major consequences for the environment. Obviously, a big consequence is the increase in fossil fuel use. As we drive more, we use more fossil fuels. It also uses 2 times more land per person than in cities. And so as our population expands and we need more arable land, this also has a consequence there. It replaces our farmland. It increases the distance to the farms, which again is going to increase our fossil fuel use, and it's going to make, it's going to put more pressure on our water system as well. And then there are human health impacts, and these are pretty significant when we talk about urban sprawl and human health impacts. So obviously, as we use more fossil fuels, we're going to increase air pollution. That's going to have an effect on people with things like asthma and bronchitis. Spending a lot of time in the car also tends to increase a sedentary lifestyle, where they talk about the commuter diet, where we stop and pick something up in the car on the way home. And so this has actually contributed significantly to the obesity epidemic in the United States. Our homes being farther apart can also lend itself to social isolation, particularly in times like now when we're staying home more. Of course, the more we drive, the more car crashes there are. And so that also has a health impact. One positive thing that can come from urban sprawl is that with more spread out populations, that can reduce the spread of disease. If the suburbs are well designed and have lots of green space, that can actually decrease the sedentary lifestyle because that encourages people to get outside. So there are both positives and negatives to urban sprawl and human health. So how do we address this? How can we change this? So the Environmental Protection Agency has actually put together 10 principles for smart growth to focus on community planning in ways that we can better develop sustainable, healthy communities. And their number one priority and the number one way to reduce the impact of urban sprawl is mixed land use. And so this is what I talked about earlier with the use of one area having office space, commercial space, education, retail, leisure, residential, shopping, all of the above. And this encourages walking. It also decreases our fossil fuel use. So lots of different impacts there. Creating mixed housing. So that gives a range of opportunities and choices. So we have both large tracts of land and we have close together homes. Walkable neighborhoods are a big part of sustainable development, encouraging people to walk or ride a bike instead of getting in their car and driving everywhere. Number 4 is encouraging community and stakeholder collaboration in development decisions. I don't know if you guys have ever been to a city council where they're talking about zoning. You'd be surprised by how little people who live in a city actually contribute to the decisions that are being made. So cities are trying to move towards involving the community more. Number 5 is taking advantage of compact building designs so that there is, again, more walking, more biking, less driving. Creating a sense of place by having a distinct and meaningful character. I would warrant that most of you can look at this picture and know that we're in New Orleans for this. So creating a sense of place is going to help to create a sustainable area. And of course, a big piece is preserving open space for farmland, for natural beauty, for critical environmental areas, but also open space for people to enjoy together. And as we talk about some of the other impacts of cities, this green space is going to become more and more important. Another important aspect of sustainable development is transportation choices. One human being in one car is significantly more fossil fuel per person than if we are all sharing mass transit. Another big piece of sustainable development is maintaining development within an existing community rather than always pushing outward. And setting boundaries for urban areas. So if you guys live in Suffolk or Chesapeake, you know that they both have what they call green zones, and within those areas, that land is preserved for agricultural use. And so that kind of sets that urban growth boundary on our cities. And then the 10th principle is to make development decisions predictable, fair, and cost effective, trying to consider all of the inputs, but also have a streamlined approval process. Okay, so shifting back to urban areas and their impact. One of the most significant impacts is urban runoff. So a typical city block, 5 times as much runoff as a woodland area of the same size. So why is that? Because if we have a woodland area or a vegetated area, 50% of the water that falls on it as part of our natural water cycle is going to go into the ground. 25% of it's going to stay shallow, 25% of it is going to be deep infiltration. That means that part, that 25% is recharging our aquifers. 25% is just in the soil, part of the water table. It's providing water for our plants and all of those root systems. 10% is going to run off and 40% is going to evaporate back off. If you look at a city where we have tons and tons and tons of impervious surfaces, that means that the water cannot penetrate very well. Only 15% is actually able to penetrate the ground. And of that, 5% is actually going to recharge the aquifers. So we're losing 20% of what would go into recharging the aquifers. And instead, most of that is going into runoff. Very little of it is going into evapotranspiration or any type of filtration. So in our natural systems, all of those variations in the ground and the root systems, they trap rainwater and they allow them to filter slowly into the ground. But when we have a city, we have lots of non-porous surfaces. Those are roads, parking lots, rooftops. And you guys know when it rains hard here, our parking lot floods and drains, right? And so all of that runs immediately off and it enters these sewer systems. And so it gets concentrated, the volume and the power are really, really high. So when it hits the streams, it erodes the stream banks, it damages the streamside vegetation, it can wipe out aquatic habitat. When we have high runoff, you get big floods during wet weather, but lower stream flows during dry weather. So we get big extremes. It gets really, really high flow and really, really low flow. Those natural systems help to buffer that by lots of it soaking into the soil. And then, of course, we have pollutants in that water. You guys have all seen when you see after the rain, you see these iridescent puddles, right? That's all of the petroleum products that are running off into our stormwater. And storm drains do not get processed. Storm drains go straight into the river, which then empties into the bay. So what's in that water? Well, sediment, dirt. There's also oil and grease and all of our petroleum products from our vehicles, all of the pesticides or fertilizer that we're using on our lawns and gardens. Of course, if we don't pick up after our pets, there's lots of viral and bacterial load. We don't have a whole lot of issue with road salt here. We don't have to salt our roads very often, but if they have been salted, that's also going into our rivers. And of course, the pavement is also a lot hotter. So how can we address this? One big way is what we call permeable pavement. So this is a relatively new development. So this can be pavers like you see up here that have space in between for vegetation. So this allows water to penetrate through. There is also actual pavement, actual concrete that allows water to pass through. Certainly not at the same rate as dirt and grass, but still better than our typical current pavement. And so this reduces the runoff and increases infiltration. Another way to help is to plant lots of trees and other vegetation, preserve those green spaces, and build up, not out. So we don't want to increase the amount of impervious surfaces. By going vertically, we can minimize the number of impervious surfaces. So when it comes to sustainable cities, we see over here our natural water cycle, where we have condensation, rainfall, infiltration, some runoff, evaporation, and it goes round and round in a circle. When we have the urban water cycle, of course, much higher percentage of runoff, much lower percentage of infiltration. So by adding a wetland, we allow both capture of pollutants and increased infiltration through those wetlands. And so that brings us closer back to our natural water cycle. So some of the things we can do using rain barrels. These are relatively inexpensive to purchase or to create. And that allows the water that hits the roofs of homes to be saved and used for irrigation purposes. Properly disposing of our hazardous waste, picking up after our pets, only using the minimum necessary amount of pesticides and fertilizers. So lots of things that we can do. One other impact of urban growth is this idea of what we call the urban heat island. And so if you think about all of the dark and surfaces in a city, so that's pavement, sidewalks, buildings themselves, those all absorb heat from the sun during the day. And in a very different way than open space does. Also, tall buildings tend to trap heat in between them. And so in many city areas, the daytime and nighttime temperatures are significantly higher than the rural areas around them. In many areas, particularly like the Midwest, where they don't have the insulating effect of the ocean, their nighttime temperatures in their cities can be as much as 10 degrees warmer than their surrounding areas because all of the pavement and buildings have trapped that heat and they're holding it in and slowly radiating it back out over the course of the evening. It does not cool as quickly. So that's the urban heat island effect. All right. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.